Good morning, everyone. It is October the 20th. I can't believe October's two-thirds gone. So next week is Halloween, whatever we make of that. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, or for those of you who I know follow up afterwards and listen later. I appreciate the support. So today's dynamic dialogue, we're going to talk about finding dollars that are leaking through the supply chain, those dollars that are draining the bottom line. So this is our normal format for dynamic dialogue. It's a forum for sharing thoughts, ideas, challenges in this interesting time that we live in. I'll do a short presentation, less than an hour, open it up for questions, comments, whatever. The link that you use today is the same link that you will use from now until the end of the year. So we have that set up, that's standardized. We've gone to a bi-weekly format. So we're doing the first and third Tuesdays. This is the third Tuesday. The next meeting will be on an auspicious date. It's going to be on November the 3rd, Election Day. So I hope you all have voted or are planning to vote. And with that, we'll just jump into today's topic. So when we talk about cost reduction, most companies talk about the procurement organization taking a lead in this, and they usually talk about unit price. So when I worked in procurement, most of the companies that I worked with and worked for all tracked some kind of unit cost reduction. It is the most commonly used method across all industries in supply chain, and it's because it's one of the easier things to track. We negotiate new prices. We look at how the pricing comes in. We get new quotes. We negotiate that, and then we multiply the savings by an annual volume that we've been given from the planning department, from the marketing department, sometimes from the finance department. But this is a projection forward. So if we have a $12 part and we reduce that price to $10, that's a $2 savings. We take the $2 savings over the 1,000 pieces that is an annual rate. So $2 times 1,000, that ends up being a $2,000 cost reduction. And we track that. A lot of companies track it on spreadsheets. Some companies track it in their MRP system. So they look at cost reductions, but they don't often count all of the offsetting increases. And sometimes those numbers get skewed because you normally buy 1,000 a year. So you place a blanket order for 1,000 a year with 3 or 4 different releases that you're going to do over the course of the year. But all of a sudden you need something for new product development and you have to place another order for 5 or 10 pieces. And that price goes up from that $10 or $12 to maybe $15, $20 a piece because the volume is so slow. And sometimes that gets included in the calculation too of the system. So the programming the system to check just for production orders is complicated enough. And I worked at a company once where we did extensive work, thanks in great part and no small part. It was all her, basically, a woman that was our finance analyst. And she set it up so that we could track production orders. So smaller quantities were discounted. We looked at the price changes from order to order. She set it up so it would track both increases and decreases. And we had a really good sense of what we were decreasing. It didn't take into account all of the volumes and the projected volumes, but we could apply those to different parts and different ways to do that. We looked at the usage over the last year, and we could apply that usage over the last year to that cost reduction and calculate an annual savings. So, but that took a lot of work, a lot of time, and it still wasn't always perfect. There were some flaws in that. But that's what we do in procurement and supply chain. We negotiate new prices. We calculate that. We record that, lock that down, and say, hey, we did a great job. We don't take into account the cost increases, and we only look at unit price because that's the easiest thing to do. So that creates a gap. There's a gap in between things like transportation costs because often supply chain organizations, procurement organizations don't track procurement costs. The freight costs come in a whole nother bucket, a whole what I call another color of money. And those ups and downs are in there because some things are expedited, some things are not. Who has authorization to expedite kind of varies from company to company, issue to issue. So there's a lot of different things going on. It doesn't take into account handling costs. So all of the transactional costs that you have to do, all of the things that you have to do to get it from from the dock into um, inventory, from inventory back to the floor and issuing all of that. Sometimes that includes transactions, sometimes that includes incoming inspection and extra handling there. So none of that really is included when we only track the unit price reductions. The carrying costs, so sometimes we get a unit price reduction because we order more. We order the annual quantity. Even if we do that in a blanket order and say we're going to take 3, 4, 6 deliveries next year for that quantity. But now if we're taking more inventory in, there's a carrying cost to that inventory. A lot of companies were shocked when they did a lot of outsourcing a few years ago. They got much better pricing because the labor rates are so much lower in different parts of the world. So in Asia, the labor rates were lower. We got better pricing, and yet we had to assume the ownership of that material when it hit a dock. So, for example, when it got to the dock in Singapore or Shanghai, then the company that was purchasing it, that they took ownership of that. At that point, that inventory became part of the inventory balance for that company, for that department, for that division, however you're structured in your organization. And some of the finance people kind of freaked out because they said, "Oh my God, our inventory balances are going through the roof. We have way more inventory than we did 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 6 months ago. What's happening?" What's happening is you were taking ownership of that material earlier, it's on your books longer, and it's increasing the inventory balance. So that has a lot of financial implications that aren't necessarily good, plus increases in insurance and things like that. It's good to put things on the water because the transportation cost per unit goes way down if you have a lot of things or if you aggregate that through a broker and get full containers. But if you have to own that inventory, and if it's expensive inventory, then that can wreak havoc with your financial statements as well. And then finally, ordering costs. So sometimes we think we're doing the right thing. We're managing the inventory balance. We're doing the due diligence on what we should buy. We're only waiting until we have a signal to buy something to place an order. But if you order things a lot uh, and place a lot of orders, multiple orders a year, then you're increasing your ordering costs. For example, if you're placing an order every week for something because you're getting signals from different product lines, it's a commonly used part, even if it's inexpensive, you're incurring that cost of cutting that PO, managing that PO, managing the invoice that ultimately comes and paying that out, whether it's through an actual check or through a wire transfer. And you're also incurring the ordering costs in terms of the handling. So whether you call it handling costs or ordering costs, every time an order hits the dock and has to be transacted as a receipt and the quantity transacted into inventory, that is a cost. So some companies count that as part of the ordering cost, getting that part in the door and into inventory. Other companies count that as a handling cost or a inventory management cost. It doesn't matter. It costs the company money. There's money that goes clearly associated with that. So what happens is we get procurement organizations who are saying, look how much money we saved. We did a great job in negotiating these cost reductions. And you did. But finance rarely concurs with these kinds of savings. Time and time again, I've been in a meeting with senior management. Procurement says, here's our savings to date. We're beating our goal of 5%, 8%, whatever it is. We're at this kind of number. And finance just kind of shakes their head and says, we're not seeing that. We are not seeing a reduction in the material cost there. But procurement or supply chain is sure they've done the work to reduce those prices, and they have. These are not made up numbers for the most part. So I rarely see anybody that's not working diligently to do this honestly and ethically, because that goes with hand in hand with supply chain work. But finance is frustrated, and procurement is frustrated because they don't see eye to eye on that, and they can't agree on what's actually happening. So we could say, who cares? Finance has their numbers, procurement has their numbers, everything's good with the company. We're doing what we're supposed to do. It's a good thing to reduce the unit price. And that is all true. So I want to step back and say, who cares and why should we care? Let's start with just a simple accounting concept of cost of goods sold. Cost of goods sold, or COGS as it's often referred to, has 5 different components. It includes direct material, so all the material that you're buying to actually produce goods and services that you sell to your customers. The direct labor, again, all the direct labor that actually helps produce the goods and services that gets those to the ultimate customer. Any supplies that you use to make and sell products, any overhead costs associated with that direct material and that direct labor, and the transportation cost. And that includes both inbound and outbound freight, depending on what your um, agreements are with your suppliers and your customers. Oftentimes, companies will pay inbound freight because they want to manage the freight rates and they get better rates than maybe some of their smaller suppliers, but not all the time. Sometimes they leave it up to their own suppliers to put that in there, and then that becomes part of the unit cost that you pay. Excuse me. Outbound freight, if your agreement is to pay outbound freight to your customers, then that is in that cost of goods sold too. Sometimes customers dictate the way product is sold to them, the transportation mode and the type. So then if that's the case, then it's not in that cost because it's paid for by the customer. And that includes insurance and those kinds of things that go with that transportation. What's not included in cost of goods sold is distribution costs and sales force costs. That's the one big exception to that. So the cost of goods sold really represents a number of what it takes to make goods and services that you can sell to your customers. Materials today, material costs vary a lot as the percentage of that. I've seen numbers as low as in the 30-40% of the cost of goods sold, and I've seen it as high as 70%. So depending on what percentage the material is, which means at what level you're buying, if you're buying a lot of box build things and actually just doing some postponement strategies on that, putting labels on it, putting in the final packaging and shipping it, then your material is going to be a larger part of your COGS. If you're actually manufacturing things and you even have more of a vertically integrated organization, then you're going to have a lot more percentage of direct labor and less of material because you're buying the material at a lower level. So it varies all over the place. But that makes up a big difference of how you track the costs and what the contribution is from these unit cost reductions. If your material costs are up to 70% of your COGS, then theoretically you would feel those cost reductions more in your supply chain and in your financial numbers because it's a bigger part of your cost of goods sold. If your material cost is only 30% of your cost of goods sold, then you're going to need some significant savings in labor as well to really drive that number down, even though you're doing good work saving 3-5% year over year in material cost unit prices. But there's a lot of other factors that can contribute to efficiency and productivity that lower cost for a company. There are disruptions of any kind, disruptions to short part shortages, quality issues, rework, process issues, aging equipment that you have to stop for. Any of those kinds of disruptions incur cost. So even if you have a price reduction, if you get poorer quality, which causes more disruptions, more defects, more rework, any of that kind of thing, then that's a problem. If you have a gap, if you have a shortage, a gap out in material being on the shelf, that's a disruption that incurs cost because you're shifting people around and you can't be as productive as you would like to be. So all of these things lead to and can exacerbate that gap between the finance and the supply chain reporting. So what we want to do is to involve suppliers and really look at not only the actual prices paid, but the actual cost incurred. One of the things that is a very controversial area when we're looking for dollars leaking through the supply chain is cost avoidances. Many companies don't track these, they really kind of ignore those. But I always am an advocate to track cost avoidance. Cost avoidance is those things where you get the notification that says, guess what? In January, our rates are going to go up by 2%. So your price is going to go from $10 to $10.20 for the unit you've been purchasing for us. If you can go back to that supplier and get them to hold that $10 price for another 6 months or another year, then that's a cost avoidance. It also takes into account when you get your initial bids before you start negotiating. So if you took the bid at face value, then you would pay X price. But almost no company does that on strategic sourcing. They get their bids, they choose their supplier, and then they actually negotiate the final price. So from that bid price to the final price, there's a gap. And that is a cost avoidance because that is what you negotiated to remove. And if you take those things into account, it shows that you are actually managing the cost in a more robust manner than just counting what you were able to negotiate as a deduction. That takes a better picture of all the things that are happening that could be driving the cost that the supply chain organization is actively working to hold that cost and or reduce that cost. It's difficult to count all the price increases. Sometimes they're on very small parts and it takes a while to see how they add up. If you're buying a lot of penny parts and it goes up, a tenth of a cent, it's hard to manage that, but it does all work into that back to that cost of goods sold number. So you want to look at those large price increases and you want to consider those. So when you're reporting and you're calculating and you're saying, guess what? We saved 5%, 10%, 12% from all these cost reductions. You really need to look at the ones that went up significantly or the high volume things that went up a little bit that are going to erode a little bit of that. To be a little more honest with yourselves, to continue to challenge the team to work down the prices and to see what you can do about that. You can't avoid all the cost increases, and they happen for lots of different reasons. For example, a lot of companies experienced higher prices in material from tariffs that were put on steel and aluminum a few years ago and are still continuing. So you can argue with that, you can complain about it, but the fact is the price from China was increased by the cost of the tariff. So you can either pay it and include it into your calculations and say, we got hit by this, or you can ignore it. Ignoring it doesn't always help for that. It doesn't always, it doesn't take that cost increase away. So you do have that. Suppliers prices can change, and suppliers, especially when you're trying traditional squeezing techniques to negotiate, if you're looking at trying to get a better price, then you may get that better price and you walk away happy and the supplier says, okay, now how am I going to make that up because I can't afford to do that. So they may say, yeah, we'll give you a better price, but we're going to have to make these in bigger lot quantities. Our economic order quantity just went up. We want to make the year's volume all at one time so that we have fewer setup charges. It's more economical for us. And you're going to need to take that material earlier. So you may say, oh, great, I just got a cost reduction for that. Sure, go ahead. I know I'm going to order those parts. I know I'm going to use those parts. So I'll order them. You can ship them to me and I'll just keep them on the shelf. Again, you raise the value of the inventory, the balance of inventory, you reduce the inventory turns, which is calculated by dividing the cost of goods sold by the average inventory balance. So you might be eroding your inventory turns. And there's a carrying cost with that inventory because that's a cost of money. So you have to add in the cost of maintaining the inventory, the security of that, the handling of all that, and then the cost of money being tied up in inventory. I've never met a finance person who says, I'd rather have inventory than cash. The two big items on the current assets are cash and inventory. And every finance person I've ever worked with, they say, I understand that we need inventory, but I would rather have cash. So manufacturing people tend to say the opposite. Let me have the inventory because I can do so much more with it. I can respond more quickly. I can make more. I can manage that. But that's not what the finance people want. So again, we have this difference of opinion of how to manage that. So if you have to take more inventory, hold it more often on your own time, then that's a cost. Lead time increases. People say, oh, it's just a lead time. It doesn't add to anything. Yes, it does. Lead time often causes you to have more inventory. If you're looking at having a 1 week supply, if you've got a lead time of 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, you may not want to have just 1 week, even 2 weeks of inventory. You might want to have some a month's worth of that. If you've got a 12-week lead time, a month's worth is not a lot of inventory to have in case you have a lot of volatility in your forecast. It's not highly desirable to have a month's worth of inventory, but again, oftentimes it's small, inexpensive parts, say like plastic parts. They're not 60 cents a piece, 80 cents a piece. So yeah, what's the heck? What the heck? It's not, when I look at the dollars, it's not that much. But when you start aggregating all this, it can really add up. And then when you have more inventory too, you have a higher risk of cost associated with obsolescence or expiration. So if you have things that have shelf life, then that's not an area where you want a lot of inventory. And if you're making changes or you want to make changes in order to do something, you want to redesign, you want to make the part cheaper, you're taking features out or adding features in, you're making a product that's more desirable to your customers that you can sell for a higher price, then you're going to be stuck with scrap and or rework on inventory if you have too much of that. Excess and obsolescence drives costs up. Again, it may cause you to order more frequently. If you order more frequently, trying to be a little more lean, a little more, keeping a little less inventory because of all of these things, then that's going to drive up another kind of cost. And then finally, transportation. The bigger the transportation is, the more consolidated, the lower your freight rate is per unit. And if you have to send more things more frequently, you're probably going to not get rates as good as you would as if you could consolidate things and get higher ones. So the supplier may give you the unit price cost reduction that you want, but you might see that cost creep in a lot of different other angles and still drive cost up so that they can get the model that they need to be successful. And then anytime you have poor response, poor performance from suppliers, then you have a cost drain. If they're slow to answer requests and your buyers and your commodity managers, category managers have to call 2 and 3 times to get a response, to get a complete response, a thorough response, then that takes time away from other things that they're doing. If you have to verify for your agreements, so yes, they took your purchase order and it's supposed to be here in 6 weeks, but if you have to call every week to make sure it's on track, if you have to call the week before to make sure that it's shipping on time, if you have to check with that supplier to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do to you, that incurs cost on your end. If they're not agreeing, if they're not complying to their agreements, if they are late on deliveries, if they only ship partial shipments to you, multiple shipments, again, that increases transportation costs and that increases whether you're paying the transportation or not. If you get multiple deliveries, that means you're paying more for handling and doing all of those things. So all of that keeps dollars just filtering, seeping through your supply chain and draining the bottom line. Some drains in performance include a lot of areas, not just cost, quality, and delivery. We talked about that. I talked a little bit about responsiveness, responding to your requests. If you have to, what I say is babysit a supplier and do a lot of hand holding to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do as a supplier, then they're not responsive and that's not a good thing. And that's taking your resources to manage a supplier in ways that you should not probably have to manage them. If they aren't a good business fit for you, if you're working very hard to handle a supplier that's very small and you have to do things like give them money upfront for materials, if you have to give them better payment terms, if you have to do a lot of things to accommodate their infrastructure, then that's not a good thing. If you if you're the small person against a large company, think like Apple and Intel, then they may not be a good business fit either because they don't deal a lot. They don't negotiate a lot of prices. They don't give you a lot um, of discounts on quantities, and you kind of do what they want you to do. So find somebody that's the right business fit. Social responsibility, this is not an area that you typically think of could be a big drain, but if you are having to accommodate suppliers who don't have the same values in social responsibility that you do, for instance, they aren't sustainable green suppliers, if they aren't taking on the value of diversity and inclusion, then that takes more of your time to do that. And if they're not compliant in an area, that puts you at risk and that costs you more, even if they're compliant with regulations, if they're not compliant with the terms and conditions, if they're not compliant with your expectations, then that's an area that's going to cost you more. If they don't have the technology to sustain what you need to do, if they don't maintain their equipment, if they don't update and upgrade their equipment as often as they might to keep your prices down and to keep their processes running smooth, then that can drain your bottom line as well. And then finally, the supply chain geography. We know today, even before the pandemic, and now actually even more so with the pandemic, that the supply chain geography can add a lot of cost to your supply chain. A lot of companies got hit early on when they had suppliers either in Europe or in Asia that were hit at different times of the pandemic than we have been. Now we have spikes and waves, however you want to call it, and companies like or countries like Germany and Spain are getting a resurgence. Different parts of Italy are getting hit. So if you have suppliers in those areas, that can affect your performance in that area, and that can be a drain as well. So I see a couple of notes. I'm sorry, I'm trying to check the chat. Um, yes, I'll go through some of those at the end. So good, thanks. Keep putting comments and things in there. Other relationships, other drains come from relationships. Again, if you have been doing business with a supplier for a long time, they should be easier to do business with, not more difficult. I've been in companies with my employer and with my clients where they've been doing business with somebody for a long time, but that customer or that supplier is difficult to deal with. And they take a lot of time and a lot of handholding and a lot of babysitting and a lot of extra effort from all levels of the organization. And that drains resources because that's taking those resources away from doing other things that might be helping make money or save money in other areas. If you don't have the right champions or sponsors, then you should look for those because they can help resolve a lot of things more easily and more readily. Escalation paths are important to have because if you have a problem, you might need to escalate that up through the other organization, or they might be escalating it through your organization. If you don't know who to call, then you're spinning your wheels saying, who do I call? Who's the manager? Who's the person in charge? Who's going to help me resolve this on your side? So you want to get those established early. Make sure that you have shared goals with your suppliers so that they're not going one way, like trying to improve quality that might be increasing your cost. However, slightly that may be when you're really actually driving for cost reductions. Make sure your goals are in the same area. Work together concurrently. Look at redesigning projects, look at updating, look at fixing issues that are between the two companies that are going to help you do business more smoothly together. Oftentimes, you design a part thinking that a supplier will use one kind of process. If the supplier isn't using exactly that process because they have a different one or one they perceive as better, then that might require a few design tweaks to make those align. Be willing to do those things so that you can align and get those costs, find those lurking costs in there and get those back to your bottom line. Cost modeling is a great way to do that. Some companies are reluctant to share that. I find that if you don't ask companies to share their profit margin, they're more than willing to share their information about their cost structure in terms of what is the labor content. And they may tell you in terms of hours, but you can estimate dollars per hour. So if they tell you it has this many hours in it, okay, how do you reduce the labor content? How do you reduce the hours required to make something? And material costs, because material costs are often available publicly. So if they are buying aluminum for one price and you can buy it for another price, then you should share that and make sure that they're buying aluminum on your behalf at the best price they can get. Years ago, I worked for Hewlett Packard and we did a lot of plastic things. If you think about printers, laser printers, inkjet printers, um, computers, at the time they were making cameras and scanners and all kinds of things. They bought a lot of plastic. So they had a deal with Dow and they have very good rates. We were allowed to use those rates with our suppliers, of course. And we told the suppliers, you can use these rates with other customers too. Dow liked it because they got the volume and they got that much more business. We liked it because we knew what to expect in terms of we knew how much plastic was in a part, we knew what it should cost. And the suppliers loved it because they could save money with some of their other customers. It was a real win win situation. So look for ways that you can share that. So if you can get your supplier to share their cost, their material cost and their labor hours, maybe their average pay for that hours, and then something to do with their overheads, rough percentages, then you can look at those and you can talk about those. You don't have to worry about the profit margin because you want your supplier to make enough profit to stay in business and be healthy. And if you can reduce your costs, you really don't care whether you take it out of their profit or their overheads or three different categories. If you can reduce the cost that you're paying, then that's a good thing. So try to get the root cause, the cost drivers, reduce those collaboratively, and everybody saves. Remember that risk erodes value. I've talked before about risk, the probability, the impact, the extent of the impact. So you want to make sure that you're looking at that. If there are risks in capabilities, in capacities, in financial strength and stability of a company, there are risks in business continuity, in succession planning, there are risks in compliance. And you want to look at how all of those could manifest between you and your supply base and be prepared for those. So try to eliminate, mitigate, plan for these risks because things happen. And the more that you do that, the better able you're going to be able to cope with that and the less it will cost you. The fewer surprises you have in and throughout your supply chain, the more money that you're going to be able to save. And it's not going to be leaking through that supply chain. It's going to be staying with your bottom line. And finally, you've got to have the right skills on your team. There are a lot of skills that your team needs in order to do this. They need to be able to communicate clearly. If they can't communicate the goals, the objectives, what you're trying to do as an organization for this total cost approach, then you're not going to get the results that you want. That means they have to be able to do some financial analysis. They don't have to be finance majors, but they need to be able to understand what a payback period is, return on investment. They need to understand assets, just like I talked before, what are current assets, long-term assets. They need to be able to assess the stability and viability of a company financially. They need to be able to use cost models to try to drive those costs down. And they need to be able to work collaboratively, both internally with internal stakeholders and across the line. A very wise gentleman, one of the best people I ever worked with, told me many years ago that he felt like in supply chain, we worked 51% for the company whose name was on our badge, and 49% for the suppliers that we were trying to manage as an extension of the operations team. And I feel that's very correct. We have to represent them correctly and completely within the organization to make sure that they get the value they need as a supplier and that we value them as a supplier with their capabilities and their skills and their contributions. There are lots and lots of supply chain skills, everything from forecasting, planning, negotiating, all of these things. And you need to have access to skills in all those areas. If you don't, you're going to have to find them somewhere in your organization to augment. And one of the things that you can't augment is ethics and compliance. You have to have people who have high ethical standards, whose ethics align with your company values and that understand compliance, whether it's to things like Sarbanes-Oxley or to hazardous waste management and material safety data sheets or any of 1,600 other things that we know we have to be compliant to. Your your staff has to have those skills and that awareness to be able to manage all of that. And then finally, you need some strategic thinking in the organization. You need people who can see the bigger picture. You need people who can make complex decisions. You need people who have some leadership skills that often comes with strategic thinking. So figure out where that can come from and foster that in your organization. And if you don't have that yourself, then see if you can expand that or bring in people to the organization who can provide that. So there are three keys to what I say are improvements, or three keys to finding these dollars and keeping them out. The first is knowing your suppliers. Not all suppliers are equal. So you have to look at what are the drivers. You can have a supplier that makes a very small dollar part, but if you buy 3 million of them in a year, then you want to look at that. That supplier becomes more important the higher the volume is, even if the dollars aren't at the top of your list. And then you have to look at all the risks with the suppliers to understand the segmentation. Where is the opportunity to reduce cost? Again, not just as unit price, that's one piece, but where are more cost avoidances and where are there more opportunities to reduce costs of impacts of scrap, of delivery issues, rework, obsolescence, reduce the inventories, all of these things that you can do to manage that. One way you need to do that is to make sure that you have metrics, because what gets measured gets managed. So these are the trite sayings that you hear. What is measured improves, and without metrics, you're flying blind. But the truth is that if you don't look at that, you really are not doing what's important for your organization. I always think about the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, who were in the woods and they were leaving the breadcrumbs, which of course were getting picked up by every wild animal. So they got lost in the woods, and without metrics, you're lost in the woods. If you remember what happened to Hansel and Gretel, and one version of the fairy tale, they found the witch and she was going to bake them and eat them, and they escaped. In the darker version of that tale, she actually did bake them and eat them. So they were not unable to escape because they didn't know where they were. They didn't have a baseline. They didn't know how to get back. They didn't know how far they'd come. They didn't have any measures on anything. So get some metrics in place that are going to help you. Do a good solid baseline. And I always say, be brutally honest with the baseline. Don't kid yourself. Don't say that, oh yeah, we're really, this high when you're down here. If you're down here, start down here, because when you get to this area, then you can pat yourself on the back. If you say you're going to start here, you're just lying to yourself, and then you're not going to get credit for the progress that you make for a little bit of time. So do that. And then be willing to cooperate and collaborate. We're all in this together. I always say, when I have the same badge as someone else, I don't care what department they work in, if the company name is the same, then we are partners and we are trying to make this company as good as we can. If you're working with your suppliers, the suppliers are an extension of your operations department, because they actually make and deliver goods and services to you that you turn into goods and services for your customers. So they're part of that chain, that supply chain, and we all need to work together on this, because win-lose is very much a short-term strategy. And that works if you're buying a house, then that's fine, because you're going to buy that house one time, and if you sell it later, then that's fine, but you're going to buy that house one time, and you might not have to deal with that person that is selling it to you anytime for the rest of your life. That is a very short-term strategy. You can do a lot of things in that situation. With the supplier that's going to be supplying you parts for the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, that is not a long-term, that is a long-term relationship, and that needs a long-term strategy to augment that. That is not something where you want to win this year and then have to go back and fight that fight all over again and be in a contentious relationship for the next 5 years. That costs your company way more money than doing this collaboratively and maybe paying a little bit higher price that first time and getting what you need in terms of cooperation and working together to reduce the price over time. So again, knowing your supply base is very important, using the right metrics, cooperating, collaborating. I love this picture because whether you are the big fish or you are the little fish, this is a very symbiotic relationship and you have to work together. So sometimes your company is the big fish and all your suppliers are the little guys. Sometimes it's the other way around, that you're one of those little guys with some big supplier that you're trying to work. Like I say, if you've ever dealt with an Intel needing a chip for a part, that's a big deal. I've been in that situation a couple of times, and the only way we got the parts we needed is because we had the right relationships and we worked that. And we didn't ask for more than we needed. We weren't a really big fish. We were a little tiny fish trying to feed on a part from Intel that was in allocation. We did not need hundreds of thousands of parts, but we were able to get what we needed at the right price because we took what we needed to make ourselves healthy. It kept them healthy, didn't deteriorate from them, and we were able to build this nice relationship and move forward after we got allocation and have a nice long-term relationship with them, even though we were a very, very tiny fish in that pond. So collaborating and cooperating can really help. So, what I know for sure is there's a better way to get what you need from suppliers and find those dollars that are leaking through the supply chain. Understand the goals, needs, strategies of your company and understand how they define value, and then share that with your suppliers. Make sure you set goals for your department, get set goals for your suppliers, and make sure you have metrics, key performance indicators, or objectives and key results that you're managing. Set those clear expectations and don't be afraid to update those and change those over time. I've talked to a lot of organizations lately, and I've said the pandemic has really set the opportunity up. So if you don't have the expectations with your suppliers, if you felt like you weren't aligned, now is a good time to get very much aligned. And maybe things have changed because of the pandemic. So your company needs to say, hey, what we did in January was this. Now we're looking for January of 2021, and we need these things going forward. So, and make sure that you understand your suppliers may be resetting expectations with you as well, because companies have changed during the pandemic and we're not over this yet. We're still a long way to go, I think, through this to get to some kind of balanced, quote, normal. Make sure your suppliers feel a part of the solution and not necessarily a part of the problem. That doesn't mean that when they are part of the problem, you shouldn't call that out and say, this is your issue. Your quality wasn't good. Your delivery has not been good. But rather than just telling them that they don't do anything right, enlist them to be part of the solution. Your delivery rate has not been acceptable to us. We need to make some changes because we need to be assured that the inventory is going to be here. Maybe we have to extend our lead times. Maybe we have to build in another week's worth of cushion. Maybe we have to ask you as a supplier to hold 1 week or 2 weeks worth of inventory at your site at your cost because you incurred damage to me. And then when I need that inventory, you can overnight that at your expense so that I can not have a shutdown, because that stock out to me is too painful and too expensive for me to bear by itself. So this is what we'd like for you to do to be part of the problem. Once we get a track record of good supply, then that can go away. In the meantime, we need you to help make sure we don't have any impact from that. And don't be afraid to adjust your plans. If there's anything we should have learned the last 6 months, it's that we don't have a lot of control over a lot of things. And we don't even have influence over a lot of things. So take the best information you have, take the skills that you have from the staff that you have or that you're enhancing those skills on. Make your plans, adjust the plans, and keep going, because progress is a really good thing to do. Remember that what you can do today can really improve all of your tomorrows. So look for those dollars and stop them leaking. Our next meeting is going to be on election day. So I hope you all can come. You either vote early or vote late that day and can make our live presentation on 11/3. We're going to talk about post-election supply chains. So we won't have any idea who won the election or who's winning at that point in time, but I'm going to talk about supply chains in the upcoming months, regardless of what happens in the election, or maybe in spite of what happens in the election, or look at alternatives. And then on 11/17, we're going to talk about goals and metrics for 2021, how to set goals with your suppliers, how to set goals internally, and what metrics you might want to be using. And then in December, we're going to meet on December 1st and December 15th. And then we're going to call it a day for the end of the year. So that's a little bit early in December, but companies are winding down. So we'll stop after the 15th. That's the first and third Wednesday or Tuesday as it happens. And then we will resume in January. So we've got some events on our website that are purple-link.net. Go to events page and you can see lots of different activities, and some of those include webinars that are coming, or workshops that are coming up. One scheduled for next week on risk-based decision making, and then one for November called the new normal. These are 3 weeks, 1.5 hours a week. So over 3 weeks they meet, and to get you ready for 2021. CPSM exam prep. If you thought about getting a certification, now you can get that certification starting in 2021. I'm going to be teaching exam 2, but there are 3 exams and you can take them in any order. It doesn't matter. So that's the one I'm offering. If there was a big demand for another version, either 1 or 3, I would consider that. But I think consolidating into the exam 2 will be the best. So now I want to take a minute and look at some of the comments, or take any questions. So let's see. Companies often don't allow us to take credit for cost avoidance. I worked for tons of companies and they say that doesn't count, doesn't hit the bottom line, so I'm not going to count it. And what I say internally to my department is we are going to count it, because we are going to look at this as a team and acknowledge the work that we're doing. Sometimes someone's biggest contribution is a big cost avoidance because they managed to get something changed that prevented that higher cost from going into effect. So that lets you call out people for what they're doing as part of their jobs. It acknowledges it, and it also has a quantifiable number that you can say, look, this is what we're doing. Yes, I know we reduced these prices, but we also avoided all of this, and that is a contribution as well. Finance doesn't want to look at it because it doesn't hit anything, but for me, when I was managing an organization, I said, this is for us. This is to acknowledge the work we're doing and to encourage you to keep doing these things. Because if you do more on cost avoidance, some of that actually trickles down to the bottom line. So I think it's a good thing to do. From finance point of view, depending on how you show the cost avoidance, it's not part of the P&L. Yeah, it's subjective. I get that. And I don't argue that point, but I also think it is a valuable exercise. Now, you don't want to spend, 20 hours a month trying to collect that. But when you have significant cost avoidances that you do, and that gets people into the thought process of, oh, I am managing this cost. So managing cost isn't always reducing it, it's holding the line. And that's not a bad thing to do. So it gets people into that and encourages people to do that. Oh, rather than just accept that small increase, if I can hold that, then that's a cost avoidance, and that's a good thing. And sometimes it's not all that hard to hold a cost, or maybe split the difference on that. So sometimes they want to raise prices 2%. If you can get them to raise prices 1%, it's still an increase, but it's not as bad. So that, and again, it gives you a chance to reward your employees for the work that they're doing. And then the final comment was, often we have to develop a supplier for 12 to 18 months, and then they become the best suppliers. That's part of that onboarding and making sure that when you bring suppliers on, you do give them the attention. I have another presentation that I do that shows 60% of the work with a supplier is done before the agreement or the contract is signed. So if you have a strategic sourcing activity, you do a lot of work with those suppliers, all of the suppliers involved, and then up until you sign that contract, 60% of the effort is put into that. If you could continue effort with that supplier on, that's when you're going to get higher cost reductions, you're going to get more collaboration, and you're going to get more value from that supplier. If you put 60% of the value into the supplier just to get them to the point of on board, and then spend a little time on board and then just treat them like everybody else, those savings are going to erode. So you really want to get that. And I can show you that slide if anyone's interested. Just email me and I'd be happy to share that with you. And then there's another question. I see frequently finance doesn't get involved in the process, supply chains working on their own. And one of the reasons is that they don't work together is because finance is always looking in the rearview mirror. They're not projecting forward. And when we do cost savings, we're projecting what do we think it's going to save for the next 6 months or the next year. So you can get finance involved with that. And if you do, that can be very powerful. Um, they can look at your processes, and if they agree with the way you're tracking it, that's a big step in the right direction, even if they don't agree with the numbers totally, or they say what you're projecting isn't hitting my bottom line, but at least I understand how you're counting it. So that is a good synergy thing to get, to have finance involved in the techniques and the reporting method you use for cost reductions, because that's a powerful um, synergy that any company can benefit from. So if there's other questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or if you have other comments. So another one, planning for 2021, are you using any inflation numbers into your plans? The only ones I've seen so far are very low, the inflation numbers, because it's like putting your money in the bank. You're not getting a big return on that interest. So that those inflation numbers are not high, but that could change. And the election might change some of that as well. So who knows? And the stimulus packages too, I'm seeing companies are hedging because of that. A lot of the times, a lot of companies are saying, and a lot of economic pundits are saying, that the country needs another stimulus package, and if not, then that puts inflation at a big risk, and a bigger risk of recession to depression. And then someone reiterating, much of the important work is done prior to an agreement, working with suppliers and engineers before the orders are placed. And then after the orders are placed, it's kind of like, oh, okay, now we're just executing. So there's a lot of opportunity after that. Another question, have I seen changes on payment terms due to pandemics? Yes. Companies that had 45 and 60-day payment terms, a lot of suppliers have asked to have those reduced back to net 30, net 20. Some suppliers with financial challenges have asked for down payments. So I'll make that for you, but could I get 20% down to cover my materials and make sure that I can stay viable with my cash flow, and then pay me at the end? Some companies are trying to elongate payment terms because they're having cash flow challenges, and suppliers are not nearly as amenable to that as suppliers are never really thrilled with that when you want to go from net 30 to net 45, or net 45 to net 60. But a lot of suppliers are really pushing back, saying, no, I can't do that. I can't, we can't change that. We've been net 30 for this long, and I can't accept that right now. So I'm seeing changes requested on both sides, and I'm seeing those requests negated on both sides, and then occasionally they're accepted. So some companies, larger companies, back to that fish picture, when you're the big fish and you have a lot of small mom and pop companies, and they say, hey, for my cash flow, I need a deposit with the order. I'm happy to take your order. I want to take your order. I want to continue the business, but I need some help with the cash flow. Can you give me 25, 30, 50% down, and then the balance when we deliver the order? And some of the larger companies that can afford that are saying yes, and they're working with their suppliers. So yeah, very much case by case. Communication, transparency too. I'm not doing this just because I can say I have a cash flow problem because we have a pandemic, but here's my situation. I've lost business. My business is down. My capacity is, my utilization now is way down, because I was at 80, 85% capacity, but because my orders have dropped off, I'm now down to 50% capacity. I've had to lay people off or put people on furlough, and I can't sustain the cash flow. So if you can share rationale, if you don't have to share all the numbers to share the rationale in the situation, and to be transparent with the other party and say, this is why I'm asking, or this is why I am saying no, then that helps build that relationship, helps build that trust. And a lot of things are short term, until we get through this, until we know more about the pandemic, until we have more information, whatever. Now we're 6 months in, and I think we're asking just as many questions now as we did in March and April, with still a lot of unknowns in the future. So thanks for all the questions. Really great questions. And anybody else who has comments, please chime in. I will be sending this out to everyone. You'll get the recording. I'm going to stop the recording.